Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I thank you all for such a warm reception. The last episodes had gotten in between our first talk with Jack Stanley. And Jack is back with us today. He's part of this multi-part conversation we're having regarding phonographs. And today, welcome, Jack.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you back. And we look forward to a lot of these talks. I know you're busy, but we'll always have time, I hope.
Yeah, do my best. Yeah, sure.
We got a very warm reception from your first conversation. We had audio listeners and video listeners, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people from all over. So I appreciate your time and I appreciate your expertise. So I'll leave it up to you where you want to start today.
Well, as we had discussed, I thought it would be a lot of fun to, instead of looking at the phonographs in general, let's talk about how the people reacted to them. You know, it's a fascinating thing. What was the public's reception? What's the social history? You know, if you think about it with the phonograph, and how did it affect us? You've got to look at it this way. First off, anyone alive today, we cannot imagine our world without sound recording. It's as natural to us today as breathing, if you think about it. We don't think about it. It's there. You go into a mall, you go into a store, you go into this, that, and everything else is sound recording.
True.
But how it started was really rather shocking, you know, as we talked about in our last thing, that Edison, of course, understands theater, and he introduced the tinfoil phonograph in the offices of Scientific American, got everybody excited. So many people poured into that office, by the way, they were afraid the floor was going to give out. And as soon as that happened and everyone started to write about it, public started to react. And they reacted in various ways. I mean, first off, they said, it's impossible. And professors at various universities said, recording sounds impossible. It's of the ether. It's of the air. It's not tangible. And they understood physics. The problem was that Edison didn't. And of course, Edison just did what he did by observation. And of course, once it was proven that he could record it, people didn't believe it really worked. They thought there might be a ventriloquist, there might be someone behind a curtain. And of all things, the one thing that was mentioned quite often was it's an American machine. Therefore, it only understands English. And so what would happen, many people would come in and challenge the phonograph and speak to it in Latin or speak to it in German or just do some silly stuff that only they were able to do. You know, Bishop Vincent and Miller from Chautauqua came to visit Edison to prove him a fraud. And Bishop Vincent was very famous for his rapid patter biblical verse. And so they came and they said, we do not believe you to be real, Mr. Edison, with the phonograph. We believe you a fraud. Demonstrate it to us. And he said, no. Why don't you record on it? And they had Bishop Vincent do his rapid fire biblical recitation. And all the begots were in the right order. Everything was all set. And they walked away with their tail between the legs. They had been totally gobsmacked, you might say, by what Edison had just done. Once again, theater. He understood it. And these folks were totally destroyed in their mission. Interesting thing that Miller, of course, was the father of his second wife, Mina Miller. And, 10 years after this, Edison would marry her. Kind of an interesting thing. And he tried to prove Edison a fraud. And of course, everyone around the world was trying to figure it out. People would talk to it in different languages, and it would talk back. They couldn't figure that out at all. It didn't make any sense. And the whole world, as we know, was talking about it. But within a year, the bubble burst. because there wasn't much to do with the phonograph. You could make a recording on foil, and then what do you do with it? And so it kind of went into a hiatus, you might say, that by 1980, the tinfoil phonograph was pretty much dead.
Well, not even Edison knew what to do with it, right? His ideas were business.
But you also got to remember, also you got to remember that at this point, he's very immersed in incandescent lighting.
Right.
And so the phonograph has been put on the shelf, and he could care less about it at this point. Very focused on what he was doing. And also the money was coming in from J.P. Morgan to do this, so he wasn't going to do anything to upset the apple cart. By the way, speaking of social interactions, Edison and J.P. Morgan got along famously. Both of them loved to giggle, tell jokes, liked to dance, and they entertained each other. Edison would always wear a sombrero hat sometimes and dance around the room, and J.P. Morgan was famous for doing sailor's hornpipes. I mean, this is a match made in heaven with these two. And so they got along rather famously. And so J.P. Morgan was very, very happy to support Edison in his work. Of course, there were problems. There were arguments and questions and whatever. But you got to remember the first lighting of New York City was where J.P. Morgan wanted it, right on Pearl Street, right by its offices. So, I mean, it was done in that manner, the Pearl Street station. But once Edison kind of lets the phonograph rest a little bit, the Bell Tainter crowd gets together. They take a tinfoil, put wax in the grooves, and they recite Shakespeare, which we mentioned before. They said they didn't want to mention a silly nursery rhyme. And as soon as that starts, they use wax. That spurs Edison into action. And he tells them he'll develop the phonograph in spite of them, because they actually came to him and said, let's work together. And he said, to hell with you. I'm going to do it on my own. And so war was declared between the Bell Tainter group and the Edison group. And of course, Edison develops his machine and uses some theater as well. I mean, you see the photograph of Edison looking totally exhausted right by the phonograph after working it on for 3 days straight. Of course, there's another photograph taken about a half an hour later where he's sitting there pretty happy with the whole crowd, but that's something else. And so once the phonograph becomes part of our existence, and it's interesting to note that it all started by the Columbia Phonograph division of Edison's company. They started issuing musical cylinders instead of business because they had the National Phonograph Company thing that they were doing. I don't think it was called National Phonograph. I can't think of the name of it right now. Someone will correct me when they're watching this. With Jesse Lippincott, Edison and Jesse Lippincott got together and created a whole series of districts to do business machines. And the one district that was a little bit of a renegade was the Washington, D.C. District of Columbia District. And that was headed by Edward Easton. And they were renegades, and they started putting out musical cylinders. And eventually, that is the group that broke from the Edison group and formed the Columbia Phonograph Company. And eventually, they merged with Bell and Tainter, which had created the Gramophone Company. And collectively, they became the Columbia Gramophone. And of course, at that point, once we start having musical cylinders, it becomes something that's used in the home. And people would hear music. It wouldn't sound that good. In fact, I remember talking to people when I was young and starting this that were around in the 80s, and they would talk about how their parents would react to the phonograph. And what they would often say, they would say, it sounds better in the next room. It took on the room resonance, perhaps, and it didn't sound so tinny and kind of nasty. But that's a comment that was made by someone in the early phonograph. And so you had music starting and all kinds of stuff like that. And that started a whole new genre where people would collect recordings of perhaps popular, operatic, classical, spoken word, and they would start to put these in the house and display them, sort of almost like fancy books. You had your phonograph, which is an extremely expensive expense in those days. And you had your cylinders, and eventually you had the Berliner disc. And all of these devices started to become a feature within the home. And it would influence how the home worked and how people understood music. You know, you got to think about it. Years ago, a home entertainment system was your mother at a piano. I mean, that was about it. And so all of a sudden, you could listen to music from an opera or listening to something from a classical waltz or hear the spoken word of something from a Broadway show. I mean,
Well, right, because at that time, only affluent people could afford to go to Broadway shows or could go to the opera.
oh,
So
yeah.
the common man, especially in rural areas, never had heard an opera.
Yeah, that's true. Only with a traveling show. And a lot of time you didn't get
Right.
that kind of quality. You had to go to a vaudeville house in those days. And you would see the 8 shows, and they usually had one person doing classical, and they usually weren't of the highest order. And you didn't get to hear the quality singers. And to be honest, on the phonograph, you didn't get to that point either in many respects. It wasn't
Right.
until the 20th century, you know, and with the gramophone and typewriter were the really strong advocates of recording operatic and classical voices ahead of just about everybody else. In the United States, we were doing band music, coon songs, and of the like. It was very light fare, and occasionally some classical music. G&T, which incidentally introduced that image of Nipper looking into the gramophone, which was taken from an Edison Bell cylinder machine initially.
Right.
That eventually became a copyrighted image for the Victor Company. Interesting thing, how that came about is that Berliner copyrighted that image while he was still in business in the United States. And of course, once he joined Eldridge Johnson and creating the Victor Talking Machine Company on October 3rd, 1901, that image was made part of Victor, and it became the most well-known image in the world. You know, for many years, until well into the 20th century, Nipper looking into the gramophone was probably one of the 10 most well-known advertising images known, you know, with Coca-Cola and stuff like that. So just to mention the fact with social history, of course, is all of these various things and all of these expensive recordings, as it was said by people back then, that they have in a way replaced Dickens and Thoreau and many other great writers on the shelf. There would be the books of the Red Seal records that cost a small fortune. You know, you could buy a Caruso recording, but it was going to set you back $3. That's a hell of a lot of money back in, you know, the first decade of the 20th century. You know, when the average salary was about $5 a week. And it also led to some social humor, too. When the first Lucia Sextet was recorded in 1908, I believe, its English translation was, "What restrains me?" And the answer was $7. And that was the price of the record. It was a $7 record. So, Lucia Sextet, what restrains me? $7. And that was a standing joke for a long, long time, right from the Victor catalog. Victor had a very interesting philosophy when it came to recordings. If you got one great singer, it was $3. If you got two, it was $4. If you got three, it was like $5 or $6. And then if you got four or more, it was $7. And think about that, $7. That's an amazing amount of money. And there was inter-office letters going back and forth in Victor, and everyone saying, don't you think that's a little high? And he said, no, this will attract them like crazy. And it did. People saved up and bought these $7 records. 3.5 minutes of entertainment at the cost of a week's salary plus. That's pretty amazing.
So were there machines, were they giving away some certain machines at that time when you bought music, or is that more cylinders that took place?
No, there was Victor had their premium machine. It was a Victor P.
Oh. Yeah.
And if you went to a dealer, or if you were spending a lot of money in one thing or another, a company could present you with a machine, or Victor could present you with a machine, or a dealer could present you with a machine. And there again, I mean, usually the people, if they were buying lots and lots of records, they had a machine already. And the premium machine was, kind of a simple little thing. But that was something that could be done. But you got to think about the price of these records. That was an awful lot of money. And here's some stuff I wanted to share with you. And I would love questions. If you got questions, it would be great. Makes it easier to toss some stuff back at you.
Well, it was the premium. Was the O as well? The O of freebie, or no?
No, it's just the P. Just the P.
And there were a few different versions. I know there were pieces that were all
I think there was
thrown together.
3 different versions, I think.
Yeah, I think you have one, I have one, and ours is, if you compared them, they're like, I think they're like totally different.
Yeah, mine is right from the very beginning of it. What was the number of it? It was 634. 634, just the P. It's the first one. It's right at the very beginning. There's a handful of machines that are older than that, but it's right at the beginning, as far as I know. But think about a couple of things just to throw at you real quick. Is the Victor Company was really savvy in getting the public involved. They really realized that the way to sell stuff, the way to get people involved, was to look at it in a social manner. And they started doing things like creating the Victor Book of the Opera and what we hear in various types of music and this type of music and educational programs. All of these things to get people involved in recording. This is one of the more unusual ones that you don't see very often. This one here.
Move it a little bit the other way. No, move it
the other way.
You're okay in the center a little bit. Just move. Yeah, there you go.
This is the Victrola in correlation with English and American literature. That's really quite a stretch, but this is examples of the stuff that they did. This is one of the more unusual sides of it, because they had to challenge all the battles that were going against the recording industry. Perhaps one of the loudest critics was John Philip Sousa, interestingly enough. He goes back with that term, canned music. And then something absolutely devastating happened. Jazz started coming out on records, which he hated. And I'm
sure he did.
God, did he hate it. And he wrote articles for magazines where he was talking about those moaning saxophones and people dancing and swaying in dangerous ways. And a woman going to a dance wearing a corset is called Old Ironsides and stuff like that.
I know. I have a cylinder that even before, when they were calling it jazz, they were calling it jazz. J-A-S-S.
Yes, J-A-S-S. There was
And
a
it says
term for jazz, by the way.
there was.
Yeah, it was used by a lot of musicians years ago as kind of a catchphrase of "gonna have some fun tonight, gonna get jazzed."
Yeah.
And polite society got a little upset about that, and soon became jazz. But yeah, it started out with jazz, and there was different spellings of it: Jas, Jass, and Jazz, whichever area you were from. And of course, that had a profound effect. And Sousa used to commiserate with Thomas Edison, and they could both sit there and fume over the whole world of jazz surrounding them. That must have been fascinating conversations, because Edison was not an ardent fan of jazz either, but he understood that to be successful in the biz, as he liked to call it, you had to let some of that music come in. And so he started listening to it. And it's hilarious to read his comments because he says, wow, this has got bass. This has got snap. This is good. And you hear another one. He said, this has too much bass. I put the record on and it started dancing across the floor and took off. Or another time he listened to it and said, this is great stuff. Flappers will like this. And perhaps my favorite comment by Thomas Edison listening to a song, he said, how do you dance to this? And one has this image of Edison in his bunny slippers and listening to the music, trying to figure out how to kind of dance to this music, because he liked dancing, as we know. And so I can kind of imagine that stuff. It was fascinating when I was reading through some of that stuff. And he said, the saxophone was never made for jazz. He was an expert on the issue, of course, as we know. And of course, the public decided what was popular, what was good, social response. And the phonograph would, as time would go on, inspire, influence, change, and totally color life. Because life would be changed by what was recorded. And people could change how life was by recording certain types of music, certain types of singers. It totally changed the fabric of the world. It's really quite profound, what happened with sound recording, how it basically was invented and was basically a toy, but eventually it became something that could convey ideas, images, thought, and, of course, most importantly, entertainment. And that would...
Right.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you had this time period. You think about the time period
Oh,
in the
yeah.
beginning of the
Oh,
of the 1900s that this jazz is coming in, New Orleans kind of music, and it's a little different. And of course, New Orleans predominantly French, but I mean, even the states still set up differently than all the other states. The other ones are almost like a common law district, and Louisiana tends to be more French, which is more of a codification system. And at that time, you have this great migration, right?
sure.
You have Jim Crow laws that get substantiated by a case in the United States Supreme Court called Plessy versus Ferguson, which is
Yes.
separate but equal. It becomes the law of the land, right? So now Supreme Court says, you do have to sit in the back of the bus. So everybody starts migrating north, right?
Yeah.
Where these things it is. And with them comes jazz to Chicago.
Sure.
With them comes jazz to New York. And now it spreads. Affluent people are now seeing, affluent people that happen to be white are now seeing these clubs and going to these clubs that they never have been before.
That's true. It's interesting to note with that early jazz that the African American community is more or less left out of the recording industry. Like the original Dixieland Jazz Band is basically New Orleans jazz, but they're all white musicians copying what they heard.
Right.
by a lot of the African American community. However, soon you have W.C. Handy starts recording, and Noble and Sissel. You know, I got to talk to U.B. Blake, and no, Noble, Sissel, and
What is-
U.B. Blake started in the teens, and I got to talk to U.B. Blake in the early 90s, and he was fascinating to talk to him on the phone. And the interesting thing was he mentioned that much of his work in his early days was playing piano in houses of ill repute, as he put it. And of course, they did that a lot of music and that whole Broadway show, which I can't think of the name of right off the top of my head, but it was Noble and Blake, or Sissel and Blake, excuse me. And they did their first Broadway show, which became a big, big, big hit. And of course,
Really?
U.B. Blake, of course, would live until 1983. He and Sissel made a recording for Edison. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about that is that the African American community would start to become a part of the industry. You had race records with some, but also what is very interesting, you had a lot of small independent labels, Black Swan and things like that, that would record a lot of these great, great jazz performances, and a lot of the torch singers of the 20s, a lot of them in Chicago. A lot of this was all in Chicago, because that was one of the jazz centers of that movement with a lot of the African American community.
Hmm. It's funny. It's so similar to what happened with rock and roll.
Sure.
But it all came from the South and all came up, and there were these Cadillac records and, Sun Records, which is in the South, but Cadillac, I believe, was in Chicago.
Mhm.
And they all did about the same type of things, where people migrated, and then obviously white people started copying how they played and how they wrote their songs.
Yeah,
So
that's so true. It's very true, because and you have to remember that there was so many barriers to individuals to make recordings or to even be heard by, the talent
right,
agents looking for people.
even in the North, it wasn't
Oh, yeah.
just the South.
Yeah, it's very much so, yeah.
Though, you may not have had to sit in the back of the bus in Chicago, still the opportunities were not available.
Certainly, certainly, certainly. Very, very true. Another thing that was kind of interesting as well is the Edison company tried a lot of things to garner an understanding with the public and to share the phonograph, to try find ways of selling things. And Edison came up with an idea, and it was in his notebooks. It was going to be, they would send a Edison diamond disc phonograph to barber shops all over the country. And he said, where do people hang out and talk? In the barbershop. And so they worked out these deals where they would send the phonographs to the barbershops. And the unfortunate thing that happened is the phonographs rarely got played. They were too busy talking to each other. And that died pretty quick. And of course, we had the tone tests. And they also had something else that's very, very unique. And it was called the Edison realism test. And how this worked is they would get people off the street, bring you into a dealer, let's say, and then they would give you this, which you can't see here. But I'll read this to you because it's really quite fascinating.
Great. Thank you.
The realism test was this. They would sit you with your back to the phonograph. You couldn't see what was happening with the phonograph. And then they would ask you some questions. Number 1, state the kind of voice, soprano, tenor, etc., or kind of musical instrument you wish to hear. Number 2, sit with your back toward the instrument, as mentioned. 3. Spend 2 minutes looking through the scrapbook, which will be handed to you by the demonstrator. Now, they had this wonderful scrapbook that had all kinds of newspaper articles about the great singers and the great entertainers and the great this and that were recording for Edison, and a lot of the tone tests and whatever. And so this was all put together carefully so people would look at it and get a sense of how important Edison recordings were. So it says then, select one of the clippings at random and read it carefully. 5. Having read the clipping, recall the last time you heard the kind of voice or instrument in which you were asked to hear. Picture the scene. When it is clearly in your mind, say to the demonstrator, I am ready. Then, number 6. After about 45 seconds, after the music begins, close your eyes slowly and keep them closed for a minute or more. Then open your eyes for 15 seconds, but do not gaze at your surroundings. After this, close your eyes again and keep them closed until the end of the selection. This is some pretty wild instructions. And then the result. Are you ready? The result is you should get the same emotional reaction experienced when you last heard the same kind of voice or instrument. If you did not obtain this reaction at the first test, it is due to the fact that you have not totally shaken off the influence of your surroundings. In that case, you should repeat the test until you are no longer influenced by your surroundings.
I want you to get lost in the moment.
Yeah, this is your instruction manual. This was given to me by a wonderful collector. He's long gone now. His name was Dave Heitz. And Dave Heitz had his own museum building in his yard. It was a big barn, 2 floors, filled with every kind of machine you can imagine. And he had the scrapbooks. He had everything. It was amazing. I mean, he was a pharmacist who had developed some patents, so he was able to purchase quite a bit of stuff, and he created a massive collection, like right from the get-go. And I used to work with him sometimes, and we were thinking of doing a book together. And so I would go up there, and we'd just sit down and start going through stuff. And every once in a while, he'd say, here, take this. You should have one of these. And I said, thank you. And he used to share some of the stuff that he had with me. And unfortunately, he got ill and passed away 20 years ago.
Sorry.
He was quite young. He was like 60 years of age at the time. Yeah, unfortunately.
There's so much, and I said this to someone the other day, there's so much of this hobby is the oral tradition. As many as, even though there's books and things, it's really from one collector or one observer to the next.
Sure.
There's so much of it that hasn't been deposited down. And so much of it, we're not sure if it's what is true and what's not, you know?
That's the unfortunate problem with a lot of history, really, if you think about it.
Sure.
History is relative sometimes. But you know something, there is some of this stuff, like this is something that's not really talked about much at all. And it's a fascinating chapter in sound recording. I mean, the Edison realism test. I'm sorry?
So when that was that, I wanted to ask you about that. So was that done with diamond discs?
Yes.
Or with everything?
Diamond discs.
Diamond discs.
The cylinder never was used in that kind of fashion for several reasons. First off, Edison was not really that involved with the cylinder. You know, he was busy doing so many different things. Let's say from 1895, let's say, to like 1910 10. Think of Edison cement, and
Right.
there was so much going on with cement. Cement was one of the biggest products of the Edison company and probably the least talked about. The Panama Canal
But
was partially made of Edison cement.
right. But what about he did pick the music though, didn't he? For cylinders or no? Did
No,
someone else do?
no. That's the interesting thing. A lot of the music for the cylinders he didn't. He had people that were picking a lot of the music. There were times he did. He had Victor Herbert working for him for a short while. And Victor Herbert, of course, was a composer, musician of the highest order.
Right.
And he worked with Edison for a very short time. And Herbert couldn't tolerate Edison because Edison's views on music drove Herbert nuts. And eventually Herbert
Sure.
told Edison what to do with his ideas about music and left and refused to ever deal with Edison again. But with the disc, it was something totally different because the cylinder industry, the cylinder biz, as Edison liked to call it, its biggest moments were in that period of time, 1895 to 1910. That was the major time of the cylinder. The cylinder was starting to die after like 1908 with the introduction of the 4-minute cylinder. It wasn't dying fast, but it was dying. It was a slow progression. When the disc finally starts, it's at the end of this period. Edison's in his 60s. He's not in his 40s. He's not at that busy point in his life.
Right.
And also, his health has taken a slight turn. And, as I mentioned before, he's a diabetic. And Mrs. Edison kind of reads him the riot act and said, we're going to slow down. And so he finds out that there are experiments going on with disc records because everybody in the company is saying we're dealing with a dying animal here, the cylinder. We need to get to the disc industry. He could have purchased deciding interest in the Columbia Phonograph Company. It was offered to him, and he turned it down, which would have given access to a disc industry and a cylinder industry, if you think about it. But when he discovers that there is interest and some experimentation, he announces to everyone that I am ready to do the disc and I'm going to head the project, which to many, they said, well, don't you want to look at some cement, And so he takes over. And
when you look at the diamond discs, I don't know how many I have, probably 500 or 600. When you look at them, you could see where he was, and maybe somebody else started taking control.
Oh, well, the interesting thing about the diamond disc is a composite record, of course.
Right.
Much of it was developed by Jonas Ellsworth, which is a name we don't hear very often. That was Edison's chemist. Ellsworth developed a lot of all the chemical variations for Edison. He dies, I think, around 1914 or so, 1915. And it's a big loss for Edison. But he develops the condensite, that whole plastic, that it's like a phenol kind of plastic, very much like Bakelite. And so much like Bakelite that Bakelite and the Condensite company are suing each other like crazy because they're basically developed around the same time and basically the same kind of thing. And what's really fascinating, they're about 8 miles apart. Theodore Bakelin is in Newark, New Jersey, and Edison is in West Orange, New Jersey. They're practically close enough to wave at each other. And the battle goes on and on and on between Bakelite and Condensite. What's really interesting, just to jump way past this, is once Edison's done with the phonograph and it's all left to go, the Dow Chemical Company purchases not only Bakelite, but also Condensite. So the Cadenzite company is under the umbrella of the Dow company today, which is kind of an interesting thing. But to go back, that diamond disc, it took a lot of research, practice, and experimentation to make it what it was. I mean, it is perhaps the most phenomenal acoustic system developed. And that is due a lot to Edison. I mean, Edison was anal with this disc, and he just focused. And I went through tons and tons of his notebooks and reading the stuff that he would just go through, and they would experiment on one little thing, and it would be an entire book focused on that one little issue. And then this and that and everything else. And the quality of sound's incredible. What was on the record sometimes is a little debatable, because as Edison ran everything and did pick the music, at this point, he is judge, jury, executor, I should say. He has complete control over the phonograph. And if anyone goes against his views, look out. Because he would pick the music. There was a music book, and that would be the allowable music. Nobody could come and make a record of their greatest hit. They had to see if the music was in the music book. And if it wasn't, they would try to convince that singer, that instrumentalist, that whatever, to do something that Edison liked. And that led to a lot of problems. One other thing real quick to mention about that, he didn't think you needed the name of the artist on the record. Now, if you want to talk about understanding the star system, which Edison did for himself, he should have known that you need the name of the artist. I mean, if you're going to sell a recording by a famous singer, put their name on it. You know, you don't want to see tenor with orchestra, bass with orchestra, violinist, string quartet. Well, who are they? That's insane. But for a while, the Edison disc, and I'm sure you see that on your Edison discs, there's no name. It just says what it is. And it could be anybody.
You have to look at the matrix number and then go back to the database and then look up the matrix, and then you find out. And then very
so
interesting.
Simple,
Yeah, it's so simple. That if we didn't have the database, it would be even less simple.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that you go and you see the same matrix, recording matrix, the same recordings, and see where the same recordings were used over and over again by different companies and different. You'll see the same matrix that was on a 4-minute Amberola, and now it's on a diamond disc. It's interesting. The same recordings are used over and over and over again.
Well, yeah, there was, how can I put it? It was a very confusing period of time. And once they got over that mess, and Edison finally was convinced, you know something, you should put their name on the record, World War I starts.
Right.
And those records used a lot of chemicals from Germany. And suddenly the chemicals weren't coming anymore. And so they tried to make their own copies of the chemicals, and they worked, but they weren't great. And if you notice, there's a great deal of noise. Those records made like in 1917, 1918, they're noisier than hell. And even on that recording called Greetings from the group at Orange, or the gang at Orange, there's someone that's on that record says, I was not responsible for the black labeled records.
Well, a lot of the chemicals from in Germany, you bring the war, were owned by companies in America, right? The DuPonts tried to sue the United States for destroying their chemical plants during the war.
Oh, yeah.
So And then somebody said, you better knock it off.
That same thing happened in World War II with Henry Ford.
Yeah.
But the Edison company was doing all that. And then speaking of World War I, there was also another issue. The entire factory complex burned down.
Right.
And everything.
It seemed everybody had a fire, right? Victor had a fire. Edison had a fire. And that's just the nature of the way factories were in those days, unsafe.
Sure, I would say so. I mean, Victor had a number of fires, actually, but none were as spectacular as the Edison fire because, in fact, Edison was on top of his battery building, which is the one building that didn't get damaged. I think the administrative building wasn't damaged either. But he was on the roof and he was talking to Charles, his son, and said, "Go get your mother. She's never going to see a fire like this." And because it was every color in the rainbow, because there was every chemical, all those phenol plastics, and the film and the nitrates and everything else there. So the people, the companies, they all kind of worked together. They all kind of shared ideas. The companies would listen to what the public liked and try to satisfy it. Sometimes the public didn't hear what it liked and it would complain, or they wouldn't buy their records, or they didn't like the way they were done. It's interesting how all of that happened, how people dislike certain types of music. Some people like this, that, and everything else. But nonetheless, as you look at it all, the phonograph, recorded sound, transformed humanity, changed humanity. Will never be the same as we were before 1877. Totally became a different animal after that event. It totally changed the way we look at everything and how we listen to everything.
True. Thank you. It seems like a good place to leave it if you want. Sure.
I think it's a good place to stop.
Great. Thank you again for coming.
Sure.
We look forward to having you again.
Oh,
I know you're busy
jabber on and
coming
some
up.
stuff. I'm sorry?
I know you're going to be busy, right? You have a project coming up?
Yeah, we're going to be doing this thing with Lincoln's funeral. I have the sheet music for his funeral march, and Gavin Rice is orchestrating it, and we're going to do a little documentary thing on it. I also have, it's kind of a fun thing. I got it right here next to me so I can share it with you. Is this it? Oh, you know something? I don't know where it is. I have the Lincoln funeral programs.
That's great.
I thought I had them here, but I don't. They're in another shelf somewhere. But we're going to do that whole thing on the Lincoln funeral. It's the 160th anniversary. People love O's and fives with anniversaries. So we're gonna have that funeral march, and Gavin's gonna have that all put together. And I haven't talked to Wyatt, but I thought this would be a great thing to record on cylinder.
I agree.
I think that would be kind of a cool thing to do. But maybe Wyatt will see that before I get to talk to him. But nonetheless,
I'm sure he will.
It's a pleasure joining you again, and look forward to joining you some more.
Pleasure's mine. Yes, it was great. Everyone's going to love it. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. Please like and subscribe our site. And thank you, Jack, again for just a great hour of great stories and significant facts we all need to remember. So thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.